Episode 2, Crisis and Conflict in the Late Middle Ages, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Miles. Today we're jumping into a period where everything feels like it's going wrong at once. War, conflict inside the church, uprisings, it's kind of a mess. Is this one of those moments where people at the time know they're living through a crisis, or does it only look that way in hindsight? Dr. Morgan, can you help us make sense of this?
Absolutely, Miles. We're looking at the 14th and 15th centuries, what historians often call the late medieval crisis.
Okay, so historians actually label it as a crisis.
Yes, and for good reason. Governments are struggling, the church is divided, and everyday life is becoming more unstable.
So this isn't just dramatic language, it's describing a real breakdown.
Exactly. When I take students to northern France and we visit places like Crécy, I always tell them these weren't peaceful landscapes. They were shaped by repeated conflict.
So people are actively experiencing instability.
Exactly.
Professor Theo, what does that feel like on a personal level?
It feels like uncertainty. Imagine the rules you've always trusted suddenly don't seem to apply anymore. The church, which is supposed to guide your spiritual life, is divided. Kings are fighting long wars that drag on for generations. And your daily life, your work, your food supply, your safety, becomes unpredictable.
So it's not just one problem, it's everything.
Exactly.
All right, let's break it down. Where do we start?
We start with the 100 Years' War.
Okay, first question. Why is it called the 100 Years' War if it's not exactly 100 years?
Great question. The conflict runs from 1337 to 1453, so about 116 years.
And imagine living through that instability across generations.
It begins under Edward III of England and Philip VI of France, both from the Valois line.
So this starts as a family dispute? What does that actually mean in practice? Like, why does a family claim turn into a war that lasts over a century? What are they actually fighting over?
At the core, it's a dynastic dispute. English kings, especially Edward III, claim the French throne through family connections, but it's also about land and power, especially territories like Aquitaine. So now you have two rulers claiming legitimacy, and once that's challenged, it becomes a test of power, not just inheritance.
So whoever can actually enforce their claim wins.
Exactly.
And this is where something new starts to take shape. What we'd later call national identity.
What does that mean here?
At the beginning, this is a dispute between rulers. But as the war drags on, people start to think less in terms of loyalty to a lord, and more in terms of belonging to a kingdom, England or France. Language, symbols, even who you see as us versus them starts to solidify.
So the war is actually helping create a sense of being English or French?
Exactly. It's not fully formed yet, but this is one of the moments where that identity begins to emerge.
And that's why it doesn't stay a simple family dispute. It becomes a long military conflict over who actually controls France. But once fighting begins, it pulls in questions of land, loyalty, and control, especially regions like Aquitaine.
So it becomes bigger because other issues get layered on top of it?
Exactly. Think of it like a spark that turns into a much larger fire.
Okay, so walk me through what actually happens, because right now it just feels like a long blur.
That's fair. Early in the conflict, the English had significant success. Battles like Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415 showed the effectiveness of the English longbow against heavily armored French knights. These victories revealed that traditional feudal armies, based on mounted knights, were becoming less effective compared to more flexible infantry forces.
Wait, so heavily armored knights are losing to archers?
Yes,
So this is changing how wars are fought?
exactly. Warfare is becoming more organized and more dependent on centralized authority. Kings increasingly relied on paid soldiers rather than feudal obligations, which helped strengthen the power of the state.
That is a big deal.
It is.
And culturally, it's huge. The knight represents honor, status, and medieval ideals. But now that image starts to crack. It's like when an old movie genre stops feeling believable to a modern audience.
So the culture is changing alongside the battlefield.
That victory at Crécy leads to the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360.
What does that treaty actually do?
It gives England control over large portions of French territory, including Aquitaine.
So England is winning for now.
Exactly. Later, the conflict starts up again under Henry V.
Is he the one connected to Agincourt?
Yes, in 1415, Henry V defeats a much larger French force at Agincourt.
That's kind of shocking, like an underdog win.
In many ways, yes, and that victory leads to the Treaty of Troy in 1420.
What does that treaty say?
It recognizes Henry V as the heir to the French throne.
Wait, so the King of England is supposed to become King of France?
That's the idea.
That feels like it should end the war.
You would think so, but it doesn't. Political agreements on paper don't always match reality on the ground.
So the conflict keeps going.
Exactly, and that's what makes this war feel so long and unstable.
And you mentioned geography earlier. How does that matter?
If you stand in Calais, which England controlled for part of this period, you can literally see how close the two kingdoms are. This isn't distant, it's a shared space of conflict.
So invasion is actually practical.
Yes,
And that proximity makes the war devastating for civilians. Armies move through farmland.
So they're not just fighting each other, they're destroying the countryside too?
They burn crops, seize food, and destroy villages. This is what we call chevauchée, raiding tactics meant to weaken the enemy economically.
So regular people are the ones paying the price.
Exactly.
So what turns the war around for France?
Joan of Arc.
Okay, I've heard the name, but what actually happens?
She's a peasant girl who claims to receive visions from God.
That alone feels like something people wouldn't normally take seriously. So why do they listen?
She convinces Charles VII to let her support the French army. This is during the later phase of the war, when France is divided and Burgundy is allied with England. In 1429, she helps lift the siege of Orleans.
So she's not just symbolic, she's actually involved in the war effort?
Yes, but her biggest impact is psychological. She restores French morale and gives a sense of divine support.
So belief actually changes the course of events.
Exactly.
That shows how deeply religion shapes people's worldview. If people believe God is on their side, it changes how they fight, endure, and understand victory. And this is also where that earlier idea of national identity really starts to take on emotional weight.
What do you mean by that?
Earlier we said people are starting to think in terms of England versus France. Joan of Arc intensifies that. She isn't just fighting for a king, she's framed as fighting for France itself, as something almost sacred.
So it's not just political anymore, it's emotional and religious at the same time?
Exactly. Religion and identity fuse together here. That combination makes the idea of France feel more real and more personal to people.
So this is helping create that sense of national identity we talked about earlier.
Yes. And now it has meaning people are willing to fight and die for.
And then she's executed, right?
Yes, in 1431, after being captured by Burgundian allies of England. She is tried for heresy in Rouen and executed by burning.
That's intense. All right, so that's war. What's happening with the church at the same time?
The church is going through its own crisis.
Before we get to Avignon, what was the Pope's role supposed to be before all this?
Great question. In the High Middle Ages, the Pope isn't just a spiritual leader, he's a major political authority across Europe. Popes like Gregory VII and Innocent III claim the right to discipline kings, approve rulers, and even depose them. Think of the investiture controversy, conflicts over who has the authority to appoint bishops.
Why does it matter who appoints bishops?
It matters because bishops aren't just religious figures. They control land, collect revenues, and wield political influence in their regions. If a king appoints a bishop, that bishop is likely loyal to the king. If the Pope appoints the bishop, that loyalty shifts toward the church instead.
So this is really about control, who actually has power on the ground.
Exactly. Controlling bishops means influencing both the spiritual lives of people and the political structure of a kingdom.
So the Pope could challenge kings directly?
Yes, and sometimes win. The idea is that spiritual authority is superior to political authority.
So the Pope is supposed to be above kings, not controlled by them.
Exactly.
Okay, so now what changes with Avignon?
In 1309, under Pope Clement V, the papacy moves from Rome to Avignon in southern France.
So the center of the church just moves?
Yes, and more importantly, it moves into the orbit of the French monarchy.
What does that actually mean in practice?
It means the Pope is now physically located in territory controlled by the King of France, increasing French influence over church decisions, appointments, policies, priorities.
So instead of being above kings, the Pope starts to look dependent on one of them.
Exactly. This period is sometimes called the Babylonian captivity of the church.
That sounds like a strong label.
It's meant to suggest the church is being held under political control. The papacy remains in Avignon until 1377, when Pope Gregory XI returns to Rome,
So why does this matter for regular people?
because it changes how people see the church. If the Pope looks like a political actor tied to France, then his authority doesn't feel universal anymore.
So instead of one church over all of Europe, it starts to feel divided.
Exactly, and that sets the stage for the Great Schism. And if you visit the Palace of the Popes in Avignon today, it looks less like a spiritual center and more like a fortress of political power.
So people start to question the church's independence.
Exactly.
And they also start to question its priorities. The church looks wealthy at a time when many people are struggling.
So it's not just theology, it's perception.
Exactly.
And then things get even worse with the Great Schism, right?
Yes, in 1378, rival popes are elected, Urban VI in Rome and Clement VII in Avignon.
So now there are two people claiming to be the Pope at the same time?
This begins the Great Schism. Later, a third pope is added after the Council of Pisa in 1409.
3 popes?
3.
How do people even decide which one to follow?
Usually based on political alliances.
That sounds incredibly confusing. How do you practice your religion if you don't know which pope is legitimate?
That's exactly the problem.
So how does it get resolved?
The Council of Constance from 1414 to 1418. It removes the rival popes and elects Martin V as the sole pope.
So a council fixes the problem, not the pope himself.
Exact.
That feels important.
It is.
It introduces the idea that authority might come from a broader body, not just a single individual.
That sounds like a big shift in thinking.
It is. And at the same time, reformers like John Wycliffe in England in the late 1300s and Jan Hus in Bohemia are criticizing the church.
What do they actually want to change?
Wycliffe argues that the church has become too wealthy and too focused on power. He believes the Bible, not the institutional church, should be the ultimate authority.
What does that mean in practice?
In practice, it means challenging how the church operates day to day. Wycliffe supports translating the Bible into the vernacular English so ordinary people can read it themselves.
So people wouldn't need priests to interpret everything for them?
Exactly. He also criticizes practices like indulgences and questions doctrines like transubstantiation, which is the idea that the bread and wine become the literal body and blood of Christ.
That feels like a direct challenge to church authority.
It is.
And there's also a moral argument. Wycliffe believes that clergy should live simply and spiritually, not like political elites.
So this is about both belief and behavior.
Exactly.
What about Jan Hus? Does he say the same things?
Hus is influenced by Wycliffe, but his ideas take on a more local and political dimension in Bohemia.
What does that mean?
It means his criticism is tied to both religion and identity. Huss criticizes corruption in the church, especially the sale of indulgences, and calls for reform. But he's also speaking to tensions between Czech populations and German influence in the church.
So his message connects with people on multiple levels.
Exactly. That's why his ideas spread so effectively.
And the church responds how?
Huss is summoned to the Council of Constance and promised safe conduct. But once he arrives, he is arrested, tried for heresy, and executed in 1415.
That feels like it would make things worse, not better.
It does. His execution sparks the Hussite Wars beginning in 1419.
So instead of stopping reform, it actually fuels resistance. Okay, so war, church conflict. What about regular people?
This is where we see social unrest.
Why does that happen?
A few reasons. Governments raise taxes to pay for wars.
So people are paying for conflicts they might not even support?
Labor shortages give workers more leverage. But elites try to limit wages, and people feel like the system is unfair.
So tension builds.
Exactly.
What does that lead to?
Revolts. The Jacquerie in France in 1358, led by Guillaume Cal. It is brutally suppressed by the nobility. The English peasants' revolt in 1381 during the reign of Richard II. It is triggered in part by the poll tax and resentment over the Statute of Laborers from 1351.
What happens in those revolts?
Peasants rise up against taxes and feudal obligations.
That sounds like a breaking point.
It is. In England, rebels even march on London. Led by Wat Tyler, they reach places like the Tower of London and meet the king at Mile End and Smithfield.
Do they succeed?
In the short term, no, the revolts are suppressed.
So they fail?
Not entirely.
They still matter. They show people are willing to challenge authority. And over time, systems like serfdom begin to weaken.
So even failed revolts change things.
Exactly.
So if we zoom out, this is war, religious division, and social unrest all happening at once.
Yes,
That explains why this period feels so chaotic. It's not one crisis, it's multiple crises stacking together. So what's the big takeaway?
this is a turning point. Old systems are breaking down. New ideas about power, authority, and society are beginning to emerge.
So it's not just decline, it's transformation.
Exactly. People are trying to make sense of a changing world.
All right, let me try to recap this. We've got the 100 Years' War, which starts as a dynastic dispute, but turns into a long conflict that helps shape early national identity. At the same time, the church is losing authority, first with the move to Avignon, then with the Great Schism, where you literally have multiple popes. And then on top of that, people like Wycliffe and Hus are starting to challenge the church directly, while ordinary people are dealing with taxes, labor changes, and revolts. So all of this together makes the period feel unstable. But it's also creating the conditions for new ideas to emerge.
Don't forget that the Black Plague and the Little Ice Age was happening at the same time, Miles.
Exactly right.
And that sets up what comes next. In episode 3, we're shifting gears a bit into a historiography question. We're going to look at the debate over whether the idea of modern universities actually has its roots in the Islamic world.